I'm going to talk about the latest events in the Middle East. It's been a very eventful week, and it promises to be an eventful week to come. But I want to start with an old story. I believe it's an Aesop's fable, but I'm sure it exists in many cultures. It's the story of the scorpion and the frog. A frog is swimming in a pond, actually in a river, and a scorpion comes to the edge of the river and gets the frog's attention and says, "Frog, will you give me a ride across the river?" The frog says, "No, I'm not coming near you, because as soon as you get near me, you're going to sting me and I'll die." The scorpion says, "That's where you're wrong. You see, if I'm riding on you across the river and I sting you in the middle of the river, you'll go down and I will drown. So I have an interest in not doing this. It would destroy me." Frog is convinced by this logic, and so he allows the scorpion to climb on his back. And as the frog is swimming across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. As the frog is going down, he says to the scorpion, who's also drowning, "Why did you do that? You know it means we both will drown." The scorpion says, "It is my nature. I sting." And so that's what happened. That's not an uplifting story. It's a fatalist story. It's a sense that they're both destined to die violently. Is that the case for what's happening in the Middle East today? That it's destined to be violent conflict? I'd like to think not, but we should keep that story in mind. 7 months ago today, on the general calendar, on October 7th, which in the Jewish calendar was the holiday of Simchat Torah, around 3,000 fighters from Hamas and other Palestinian militant groups launched what they called Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, coming out of Gaza. They broke through the barriers, they destroyed some of the monitoring stations, and in they came. They also launched about 3,000 rockets at the same time. Several Israeli military bases and warning stations and kibbutzim, which are residential settlements, and even cities, and famously a music rave festival, were all attacked by these militants and gunmen. When the dust settled, about 1,100 Israeli civilians and soldiers had been killed, about 2/3 civilian, 1/3 soldiers, and another 250 had been taken captive, or had been taken hostage, or had been taken as prisoners of war. You see, the terms you use depend on your definition of the nature of the conflict. 2/3 of those militants who invaded Israel were killed or captured, and the rest returned to Gaza. Now, there were thousands more Israelis that were wounded in the events of those days, of that two-day period. There were dozens of women who were raped, some of whom were afterwards killed. And the entire Israeli society was traumatized. It was a massive failure of the Israeli Defense Forces designed to defend the people living there. It was a massive failure of intelligence that this had not been foreseen, prevented, or prepared for. It was also a massive failure of strategic intelligence and strategic planning. The assumption was, before October 7th, that Hamas could remain bottled up in Gaza. You've got your barrier, you've got your Iron Dome defense system against missiles shot and rockets shot from Gaza to Israel proper. If you provide some funding from Persian Gulf nations to support Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza at some basic level, then that would keep them quiet. And if you could keep Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank as separate and mutually hostile entities, then you could continue a strategy of divide and conquer, where they are at each other's throats. They can't create a unified message. And in the meantime, you can expand settlements, you can increase the Israeli population of those settlements, and you can prevent a unified Palestinian nationalism for advocating for a recognized Palestinian state. That was Netanyahu's strategy. That was the Likud strategy. Well, that was a failure. It was a failure because obviously you could not simply contain Hamas in Gaza forever. Now, after the fires of October 7th burned out and the magnitude of the disaster was realized, we have to remember this was the worst day of mass Jewish death since the Holocaust. We just observed Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day this week, and this was the first time so many Jews had died in one day since that period. We also have to acknowledge, of course, that the Israeli casualties of those 1,100 were more than just Jews. They included migrant workers, Israeli Arabs, other people who were caught up in the fighting. Some of them were home healthcare aides for senior citizens living on these kibbutzim. By the end of October, Israel began its military response in Gaza after, bombing and so on ahead of time to lay the groundwork. And they've also had to respond to a multi-front conflict which has erupted since then. I don't want to deal with everything that's happened in the last 7 months. We wouldn't get to what's happening today. It would take too long. But it's worth remembering how this all began and what we're marking the 7th anniversary of, a 7-month anniversary of. Even at the beginning stage of the war, there were questions about what are the goals for this war? There were 2 goals that were declared to be equally valid and important: rescuing the hostages and destroying Hamas. Is it possible that one has to choose one or the other of those? Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. There were also questions about what will happen to Gaza after the war. And we still, 7 months later, have no clarity on what Israel wants to see, on what kind of aid agencies will be encouraged to work there, where the reconstruction money will come from, and who will put reconstruction money into Gaza if Hamas stays and risks another destruction in another few years. Now, Hamas failed in its major goal. Its major goal was to destroy Israel by inciting a multi-front war, such that the West Bank would uprise just as much as Gaza had, Hezbollah would attack from the north, and Iran might support remotely. The goal was a regional war that would ultimately destroy Israel. That didn't happen. They didn't even get a large-scale regional conflict. But there have been conflicts on a lower level than a full-scale war on multiple fronts. In the north with Hezbollah in Lebanon, in the West Bank itself, in the southeast with the Houthis in Yemen. There was the distance war with Iran that's been going on a sort of secretive level for a long time. And of course, the conflict in Gaza. So Israel has troops and military resources addressing all of those conflict points, not to mention the global impact on Israel's role in the world with the United Nations, the experience Israelis are having all over the world, and the response the Israeli flag and Israeli athletes produce, and of course, the experience of Jews with international organizations, their own domestic organizations, and the politics of the campus protests and anti-Semitism and everything else that we've been seeing over the last 7 months. There are fast-moving events. News about a possible ceasefire, news about Israeli operations in Rafah on the Gaza border with Egypt. But what I want to do first is take a quick tour of the various fronts. And I do want to stay near the outset that I'm limited by my sources. That is, I live in suburban Chicago. I don't live in Israel proper. That gives me an outside perspective, but also it's an outsider's perspective. I'll also note that I read particular news sources. I read the English Israeli newspaper Haaretz, to which I actually subscribe and pay. Believe it or not, you can still pay for news if you support the work. I also listen to a podcast from the Times of Israel. The Haaretz is more left-wing. Times of Israel is more centrist. I follow social media and see what people post there, which includes a range of perspectives. I read U.S. news sources from a range of perspectives, from Daily Kos on the left to Fox News on the right, and some sources in between. I like to try to get many sources to get many perspectives so that if I'm trying to present what I believe to be true, it's coming with input from many directions. So to start, I want to share an image of the map so we have a clear sense of what we're looking at here. So here you should be seeing a map of the Middle East. You'll notice Israel is the brown country in the upper left. And so we're going to kind of take a tour. Now, because I've zoomed in a bit so you can see Israel better, you're not going to quite see Yemen at the bottom. That's the brown country near the bottom of Saudi Arabia. That's Yemen. We'll get to Yemen in just a moment. So what's happening in the north? You can see Lebanon is to the north there, but more importantly is the Shiite militia in Lebanon called Hezbollah. This conflict with Hezbollah goes back to the 1980s with the invasion of southern Lebanon to try to move the Palestinian Liberation Organization out from Lebanon, which ultimately was successful, but sparked the Shiite revolutionaries fighting against Israel, often sponsored by Iran, and that's the birth of Hezbollah in the early 80s. It's continued as a conflict with Israel ever since, even after Israel withdrew to a United Nations recognized border in its north or the south of Lebanon, but Hezbollah refused to accept that Israel had withdrawn far enough, and they've maintained a low-level, very low-level kind of conflict there, not the same as when Israel was actually having troops in Lebanon proper. Now, what happened after October 7th, and after Israel began attacking Gaza more directly in the end of October, is that Hezbollah in Lebanon began to shoot at Israel. They began by shooting missiles. Israel has a very sophisticated missile defense system with actually 3 layers. They have the Iron Dome, they have something called David's Sling, and then there's the Arrow system, which can actually intercept ballistic missiles at the apex or near the height of their trajectory. So they have this multi-layer defense. It was pretty effective against missiles. It could get overwhelmed, which did happen with those 3,000 rockets on October 7th, but in general, it's very capable. So what Hezbollah did was they shifted. They shifted to anti-tank rockets and other kinds of low-level rockets that are not in the air long enough to allow for any kind of meaningful interception. They've attacked a couple of air bases in the north of Israel, and they've been shooting at Israeli tanks, military emplacements, and occasionally into cities as well. And what this low-level shelling back and forth, where they shoot a rocket or 2 in and Israel shoots something back to destroy where the rocket was launched from, or Israel sends a preemptive strike in to try to kill some commanders who are setting up for rocket strikes. Well, what's happened is that thousands of Israelis in the north have left their homes because they're simply not safe in their houses, and the government wanted them to evacuate. They're now living with family or friends, or sometimes in empty hotels because tourism in Israel is way lower than it normally would be. In fact, I had planned a trip to Israel last December that obviously did not go off. And so our hotel rooms were some of the hotel rooms that these evacuees were staying in. And Israel has put a large number of troops there in the north to prevent any kind of incursions from Hezbollah into Israel proper with troops, which has been attempted a couple of times, has been not successful. By and large, it's been rocket and shelling back and forth. Now, if not for the Gaza conflict happening right now, this conflict in the north with Hezbollah would have already produced a strong Israeli response and likely some kind of invasion. Israel's strategic plan is to remove Hezbollah to at least 10 kilometers away from the border. Why? Because that's beyond that dumb rocket range to hit Israel. Once you have to shoot something longer than 10 kilometers, it has to have a trajectory, an arc to it, and that gives you an opportunity to intercept it with your anti-rocket and anti-missile systems. Now, this Hezbollah withdrawal to a buffer zone away from the border between Lebanon and Israel was part of the UN resolution after Israel withdrew in the late 1990s. That already should be the case, but Hezbollah hasn't been following that particular UN resolution. Now, this concern for being able to return to the border, of course, is also the case around Gaza. Many of those communities were destroyed or damaged, but many of the people there don't feel safe going back if Hamas stays in Gaza or if rockets continue to be shot from Gaza into Israel proper. In the north, it's an ongoing simmer. It occasionally begins to boil, but hasn't boiled over yet, and that simmer looks to continue for the near future. After things settle down in Gaza, I don't know what will happen in the north. Now, if you move to the east of Israel, you'll see first, you notice that little pink area here between Israel and Jordan. That's the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority has some authority. It's also where there are large numbers of Israeli settlers on hilltop settlements and other territory, some of them close to the border, some of them very far afield into the West Bank. What's happened in the West Bank since October 7th is a large-scale crackdown on militants and potential militants. There's also been a fair amount, sadly, of settler vigilantism or simply vandalism, trying to push more and more Palestinian Arabs out of where they live and to encourage them to leave. It's very much the mafia, nice house there, wouldn't want something to happen to it. Oh, something happened to it, guess you have to go. And unfortunately, sometimes those vigilantes have even been abetted by reserve units who are in place in the West Bank, supposedly to protect the Israelis, but also to maintain some kind of law and order. But given that the Israeli soldiers are Israeli citizens, the Israeli settlers are Israeli citizens, the Palestinians are not Israeli citizens, they don't have the recourse to civilian courts. They have to go through military justice. And guess who sits on those courts? It's Israeli soldiers. So it's a fundamentally undemocratic, imbalanced situation in the West Bank. And unfortunately, the most militant settlers have been taking advantage of the world's attention and Israel's government's attention being on the north and in Gaza and in these other conflicts we'll talk about to be behaving even worse than normal with regard to Palestinians in the West Bank. You do begin to hear some noise about it the last month or so, but it really has been overlooked, and sadly so, because it's only producing more tension. There's also been, going a little bit further east now from the West Bank, there's also been a significant amount of unrest in Jordan. We have to remember that the Kingdom of Jordan, even though its rulers are originally Saudi Arabian, the people there, the majority, are of Palestinian descent. Either people who are part of historic Ottoman Palestine when it included both the West Bank and the East Bank of the Jordan, that is what is today Jordan, was then called the East Bank, but also a large number of Palestinians who left what became the land of Israel either in 1948-49 or after the 1967 Six-Day War. So Jordan has had unrest, but no direct violence, certainly not with Israel. But if you go even further east, you'll see Iraq, and then you see a big Iran. And Iran has been a problem at a distance and in direct conflict this time for the first time. For years, Iran has been sponsoring the Shiites in Lebanon, called Hezbollah. They've been sponsoring Hamas, which is Sunni, but is radical and anti-Israel enough that Iran wants to support them. And they've also supported the Houthi rebels, who are Shiites in Yemen. Again, that's that brown at the bottom of the map that you can see. And what really accelerated this conflict, in addition to the rockets and other material that Iran has provided to Hamas and to Hezbollah, is they've provided long-distance rockets and drones to these Houthi rebels who have decided to aim them at both Western shipping in the Red Sea and at Israel proper, aiming for Eilat, which is right there at the bottom of that point at the bottom of Israel. You can see where that brown comes to a point there. They're trying to hit Israel with rockets and drones, and so they send these long-distance attacks. This has produced a response because Israel's allies in the Red Sea, the United Kingdom and the United States, have fired back at the Houthis. But remember, all of this is coordinated by Iran. These are not the Houthis just doing it on their own. And so if the attacks in the Red Sea mess up the commerce going through the Suez Canal, have caused great delays in the supply chain that affects the Western economies, well, this is all part of the Iranian machinations involved. And when the general who was in charge of these proxy armies was killed in Damascus, Syria, by an attack on the Iranian embassy complex, which Israel didn't deny as strongly as it normally denies those kind of things. This led to a massive launch of Iranian drones and missiles directly on Israel. Instead of using proxies, it was sent directly from Iran. Now, many of those were shot down by Israel, but also some were shot down by allies in the area, and some intelligence was shared with Saudi Arabia and Jordan, providing insight into where the rockets were and what their trajectories were. That's unprecedented cooperation with Israel to minimize the impact of those rockets landing. And Israel then, in its reprisal, because there was very limited damage in Israel from those rockets and drones, had a limited response, but it showed their capability. They actually attacked a base near where the Iranian nuclear facilities were and managed to evade the Iranian air defenses. So it showed the Iranians we could do much worse if we wanted to. We just are demonstrating what we're able to do. Right now, that reprisal did not produce a massive reprisal from Iran. It's still back to the proxy war circumstance, which is not good, but is not an all-out war that we feared when Israel hit the general and then Iran shot what they shot, and we were waiting for Israel's response. What's going to happen next? That one, at least, seems to have hit a stability. So now we turn to the main event, the main stage, which is Gaza. And again, look at this map. Notice how small the Gaza Strip is compared to all these other places that we're talking about here and all the distances involved. This is really, really close. I mean, Jerusalem and Gaza and Haifa, they're not that far apart. It's a really, really small area. And there are millions of people there who have been affected by this violence. And this is the tragedy that we're facing right now in Israel, in Gaza, and in the world. So far, since October, there have been an estimated 34,000 Gazans that have been killed in the conflict. Now, those numbers come from the Hamas-run health ministry, and so there's some skepticism about how valid they are. But we should note that in previous conflicts, the Israeli army's estimate of Palestinian casualties and the Hamas Health Ministry's estimate of Palestinian casualties have been within a few percent of each other. So they haven't been radically wrong. They've been reasonable, at least in previous conflicts. Now, what does make those numbers even harder to accept, though, and why you need to qualify it, is that they make no distinction whatsoever between combat deaths of militants and civilian deaths. And so I've seen people quoting that 34,000 or 36,000 number, depending on what the current number is. I've seen people quoting that number, assuming they're all civilians. Even if it were a different number than Israel claims, which I'll talk about in a moment, it doesn't matter. There's still going to be some militants, some fighters that have been killed. It's not going to be zero. So you have to differentiate fighters from civilians. Now, when Israel evaluates these numbers, even if they accepted the 34,000 total, they estimate that there's been about a 2-to-1 ratio of civilians to combatants that have died. So if it were 33,000, just for easy math, you'd have 11,000 militants killed and about 22,000 civilians killed. And for urban combat, based on other experiences we've had in other wars, a 2-to-1 ratio of civilians to soldiers is actually not terrible. Now, the $64,000 question, or maybe the $34,000 question, given this number, is everyone that Israel says a combatant really a combatant? Or do they have open fire zones where anybody who's moving is assumed to be dangerous? We may recall that a couple of Israeli hostages actually escaped from captivity and were trying to make their way to the Israeli armed forces with, banners and white flags and so on, and they were shot by the Israelis. It was a failure of procedure, they said. But there's also been reports that, this was the case in Vietnam too, that deciding who was a combatant and who wasn't is messy in civilian circumstances. So even if the ratio is 3-to-1, we'll talk about this question of what's an acceptable collateral damage. Now, from the Israeli side, there have been about 250 Israeli soldiers that have been killed in combat operations, plus a few civilians from rockets that have made their way through since that land operation started in late October. Some of those Israeli soldiers who died were friendly fire incidents that happens in a war. Some of them were operational accidents, a car crash or tank overturns. That's happened too. And we know also that some of the Palestinian casualties were caused by Palestinians. You may recall there was a hospital that had a courtyard where a rocket fell early on, killed dozens of people. It turns out it was a failed Islamic Jihad rocket that launched, sputtered out, and landed in Gaza, and it was not an Israeli airstrike, even though it was blamed on Israel initially before any research was done. So again, when you have a war zone, civilians are going to die. That's just the way it is, but that doesn't make it good. We've had debates in the interim over what the proper quantity of humanitarian aid and food that should be delivered to the people should be. Not only the quantity, of course, but who's in charge of delivering it, because Israel no longer trusts the United Nations War Refugee Agency, or UNRWA, Refugee Welfare Agency. Anyways, they're no longer trusted by Israel because some of their staff collaborated in the October 7th attacks, and Israel's been suspicious of them for years. And we saw what happened when another nonprofit, the World Central Kitchen, tried to intervene and provide delivery of food, and their trucks too were targeted by a series of miscalculations on the Israeli side. So it, even if you get the food in there, who's going to distribute it? And we've also seen cases of trucks being delivered into Gaza and then being taken over by Hamas, who doesn't necessarily distribute the food equally or to the people that need it the most. As one Israeli commentator pointed out in an interview I heard, you never see Hamas fighters getting taken captive who are starving. The Hamas fighters are getting food, even if the people are not always getting food. I mentioned that terrible phrase, collateral damage. How many civilians are acceptable to kill on your way to killing a militant? And whose fault is that collateral damage anyways? I mean, if a terrorist or a militant is hiding behind a civilian in a civilian apartment building or in a civilian house, in theory, they've made that space a legitimate war target. But how many civilians can you kill to get a militant? What's the right number? And how careful are you? How much do you disregard the civilians when you're making your choices for targeting? And of course, wars are messy. Not every rocket, not every shell lands in the right spot. It's hard to explain your way around dead children, to be crass. Israel also has been trying to develop long-term solutions to the issue. They created a central artery road through the middle of Gaza that would provide them access all the way to the coast and separate Gaza into north and south halves. And they're creating a buffer zone about 1 kilometer long all the way around the Gaza border to provide more space between where Gazans live and where Israeli territory begins and the separation barrier exists. And this week, we saw a clash of two major issues. On one hand, the Israeli army has finally begun its incursion into Rafah, which is the last large Gaza city with a full Hamas tunnel infrastructure, intact Hamas brigades, and also about 1.5 million people, many of whom fled from the north to central Gaza. I'm sorry, they fled from the north to central Gaza, then from central Gaza down to southern Gaza, where Rafah is. That's where all of the humanitarian aid agencies have been providing support to them. And now Israel, as they have said they would do, are beginning an incursion into Rafah. They told about 100,000 Gazans on the east side of Rafah to leave. They sent in their tanks. They've taken over the Rafah crossing into Egypt from Hamas, which had been there with Hamas flags up and trying to demonstrate they're the people in charge. So it's as much of a propaganda coup as it is actually trying to prevent smuggling or other kinds of illegitimate goods transfers into Gaza in this moment of crisis. So Israel has seemingly begun its incursion into Rafah, potentially with more to follow. Just before Israel started actually moving, they had set everything up and were about to move just before Hamas declared in an official statement from Hania, who's their public spokesperson, that they had agreed to a new ceasefire and hostage release proposal that had been floated by Egypt and Qatar just as the Israeli troops were getting positioned. So the question is, this is an ongoing debate. Would they have agreed to it anyways, or was it the Israeli threat of going into Rafah that spurred Hamas to agree on the ceasefire? But the other thing we have to realize is, as hopeful as we might be that this could be the dawn at the end of the tunnel, a light of hope, perhaps, we can be optimistic about how close they are, but we might be pessimistic when we look at the details of how far apart they might be. So I just received today an email summary of how far apart they are from each other. I'm going to share that with you so you can see what this particular part, this is sources quoted on Israel's Channel 12. So it's a news source with reasonable credibility. Okay, so what you can see here is a list of how far apart they are. On the number of hostages to be released in the first phase, Israel demands 33 live hostages. Hamas is agreeing to 18 live or dead hostages, which could mean they would just take 18 bodies and return those, with no live hostages coming out in the first round. The other problem is Israel started wanting 40 hostages that were alive and in sort of a humanitarian category of women or children or people with health issues or injured. So they wanted 40. Hamas said, we can't provide 40 in that category, so Israel lowered it to 33, and Hamas is still trying to haggle it down to 18, and they're trying to haggle it to live or dead, meaning they could just return bodies. So is that getting closer? Is that far apart? On the rate of release, Israel demands 3 hostages released every day. Hamas wants to return 3 hostages every week. Why would they do that? Well, they want the quiet to last longer. And Israel wants the hostages out as soon as possible. Those are very different agendas. Now, part of the exchange, based on the previous model in November, is that if Hamas releases hostages, then some of their Palestinian prisoners will be released from Israeli jails. So on what kind of prisoners to be released and how many? Israel agrees to release 20 prisoners for each hostage and 40 serious prisoners, or those convicted of murder or something close to it, for each female soldier. See, they've divided the captives into civilian captives, female soldiers, and then males 18 to 50 who are potential soldiers. And they're treating them differently. And the males are being held to the last of the hostage release at the end. So Israel has a number of 20 prisoners for each hostage, 40 serious prisoners for the female soldiers, and Hamas wants 30 prisoners for each hostage and 50 serious prisoners for female soldiers. Well, that's, again, numbers that are not that far apart. Maybe that's a place where some negotiation is possible. Number 4, the identity of the prisoners. Israel demands a right of veto on the name of each prisoner it releases. And Hamas demands no right of veto for Israel. So Israel wants to say, you want to release this person that killed, 15 people? No, we veto that. Hamas wants no right of veto, that they can get out whomever they want from the Israeli prisons. By the way, Israel might give a list of prisoners. Hamas has never produced a list of the hostages that they have and their status of alive or dead, and has never allowed outside NGOs to visit them. So there's no idea of what's really there. We saw a couple of hostage videos released just this week that referred to what seemed like recent events. So we hope they were currently recorded and not pre-recorded a month ago. But, there's been limited signs of life like that. Number 5, on the return of Gazans to the northern Gaza Strip. Israel says only civilians may return to the northern Gaza Strip. Hamas demands that all Palestinians be allowed north, including those armed, aka including Hamas. Israel, when they made that dividing road, they want that to be a filter so that people going north are searched, and they're not allowed to go north if they have weaponry or if they're a known member of Hamas. Hamas wants to be in charge in the north and in the south. They want to stay in charge of the Gaza Strip, and so they're insisting on, and that is a bridge perhaps too far to bridge, because Israel has said they don't feel safe in their homes next to the Gaza border with Hamas still in charge, because look what Hamas did every other time they've been in charge. And then finally, on the next phases, Israel refuses to announce the end of the war once the deal is completed. Hamas demands that Israel announce the end of the war before the end of phase 1. Because Israel has said it has 2 goals: wipe out Hamas and save the hostages. And it says it wants to do both. So they can, from Israel's perspective, they can save the hostages, and then once all the hostages that are possible are back, then they'll go back to war and wipe out Hamas. Hamas, understandably, doesn't agree with that system. They might be willing to release what hostages they have or the bodies that they've been hoarding, but they want the end of the war. And so they demand that Israel announce the end of the war even before they finished releasing the first round of hostages, let alone all of the hostages. So hopefully that clarifies that we've got a lot of gaps here. Now, can these gaps be bridged? Possibly. Will Israel accept not wiping out Hamas? Possibly. Will Israel restart the war after a long truce? Also possible. Now, my personal perspectives, if I had to prioritize destroy Hamas or saving the hostages and getting a ceasefire, I would save the hostages and get the ceasefire. Dainu, enough. We have to deal with Hezbollah in the north. We have to deal with the West Bank. And Israel needs space to breathe, to evaluate the failures of October 7th, to evaluate the conduct of the conflict so far, to get a bigger picture question of those strategic issues that led to this situation in the first place, and perhaps ultimately have new elections to choose new leadership. That's a lot to cover, and there's been a lot of events even in the last few days. So I wanted to stop here with that and open it up to those here to see if you have any comments, questions, thoughts, or other issues that you'd like to raise.
Hey, yeah, quick question. Are you aware of the UN's first report on UNRWA, where they claimed Israel hadn't provided evidence that members were involved in Hamas or October 7th?
Yeah. So the problem is that it's sort of a he said, where Israel says, here are the names of 12 people who are in UNRWA that we have pictures of, riding on trucks and so on. And UNRWA hasn't accepted that evidence. There's just such a gap of trust between the two, between Israel and between UNRWA, that Israel simply doesn't want to work with them anymore. I mean, part of the problem has been that Hamas weapons have been found in UNRWA schools. They found a Hamas data command center under a hospital. That was being supported by outside money. So Israel just doesn't trust the existing agencies to not be corrupted by their exposure to Hamas. Now, if I were living in Gaza, I don't know that I could get away with not being corrupted by Hamas. I mean, they're a gang, and when you're living in a gangland, sometimes you have to accommodate the gang.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's the question. I'm sure there are plenty of high-minded, ethical people that are part of UNRWA, but I can also see that there would be people who, they're doing this for their job. You have 10,000 employees. There's going to be some people who are, have multiple loyalties or outside hobbies that interfere with the ethics of their job. So that's unfortunately the reality there. I don't know that it was enough to declare UNRWA to be irredeemably corrupt, but if Israel doesn't have confidence in them or trust them, I mean, look, Israel, this is what I've been saying since the beginning. What do you want the end game? What do you want the end result to be? Who should be in charge? Should it be the PA, the Palestinian Authority? No, we don't want them. They're corrupt and they're falling apart and they don't have credibility in Gaza. Okay. Should it be Hamas? No, they're terrorists. They can't be trusted to do anything. Should it be UNRWA to provide relief? No, we don't trust them. They're corrupted by Hamas. Should it be some kind of Arab-led coalition? No, we don't trust them. Do you want to run it again? No, we don't want to reoccupy Gaza. Well, what do you want to do?
Yeah.
Exactly.
if you don't have a vision for how this should end,
Mhm.
then you got to pick something. And part of the dilemma has
Mhm.
been, I should have mentioned this in the opening presentation, part of the dilemma has been that Netanyahu is run by his desire to stay in power. And
Mhm.
his desire to stay in power is contingent on the ultra-Orthodox religious parties and on the right-wing settler parties.
Mhm.
And either one of them have him over a barrel. They can get what they
Mhm.
want. So they were trying to pass a draft exemption law last month.
Mhm.
A draft exemption law in the middle of a war? Are you kidding me?
Mhm.
To deal with court cases that have come through that finally say, no, you're not allowed to not draft this group just because they have political sway. So, but that's this coalition government. And on the right-wing settler party, they are very jingoistic and militaristic
Mhm.
in terms of their response. And if they had to choose destroy Hamas or lose the hostages, they would destroy Hamas. And too bad, casualties in war, added to our side, but we kill a lot more of them. I mean,
Mhm.
at one point recently, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is one of these very right-wing people, who's the head of the police. I mean, imagine what that does. He was quoted as saying, "Why do you keep arresting these Hamas people? Why don't you just kill them?"
Oh, geez.
Someone said, "What kind of country do you live?" I mean, a right-wing guy said, "What kind of country do you think you're living in?" And I mean, not to mention how stupid that is, because you can interview those people or interrogate them, within the limits of the law. You can get useful information out of them, right? That's actually helped in recovering hostages and finding weapons caches. They only found that data center under the hospital because they had interviewed people they had captured. So, it's so militaristic and jingoistic, but Netanyahu can't be seen to be ending the war without destroying Hamas, because those parties will leave his government. And then once they've left the government, it's new elections. It's evaluate what went wrong on October 7th, which makes him look terrible.
Mhm.
And it's what's wrong with the bigger strategic picture that he's been putting in place over the last 20 years as prime minister, the vast majority of the time. Sorry, not the last 20 years, the last 15 years. So the reality is that Netanyahu has been running the war to stay in power. And unfortunately, so has Yahya Sinwar, who is the head of Hamas in Gaza. They've been running the war to stay in power too. And it's the Israeli civilians who are evacuated from their homes, and it's the Palestinians who are both evacuated from their homes and facing bombing and other attacks that are attempting to get Hamas, and a lack of food and a lack of water and a lack of medical care, and a lack of infrastructure and living in tents. And that's those are the people who are suffering. But the people in charge are not acting on the best interests of the people who are suffering, and that produces more suffering.
Great.
I was going to add something quick. Is it even possible to destroy Hamas? Because it's not just a cause, it's an idea. And I don't think you can just wipe it out with.
Yeah.
So is it even realistic? And what is your opinion on that?
Well, it's like the Viet Cong. How are you going to decide that you had killed enough or that you'd wipe them out? You create more sympathizers by the collateral damage that comes up, because they look at it. Is true that a number of Palestinians in Gaza are very mad at Hamas because they see what's happening and they know that Hamas made this happen. That doesn't mean they like Israel, because the labels on the bombs are, the bombs are coming from Israel. So they know that too, but they know why they're coming, and they're mad at Hamas too. So if Israel had taken a different strategy, if they had said, we're going to flood humanitarian aid into safe places where Hamas can't take it, here's where you go, and we won't bomb those areas, which unfortunately they've also done. They've occasionally bombed in those areas. And we want to save not only our hostages, we want to save the 2 million Gazans that are being held hostage by Hamas and get Hamas out of power. But you'll get, too many of the Israeli politicians have said things like there are no innocent people in Gaza, and, statements that don't differentiate. And look, if your country is attacked and you lose 1,000 people in one day, which as a proportion of your population would be tens of thousands in the United States, you might not be so inclined to be sympathetic and care as much about the group that caused this to happen, right? Or the other entity that made this happen. And you might not differentiate between the government versus the people. And, that's visceral, that's, trauma, that's anger. It's very understandable. But in terms of the long-term strategy and plan, I think, Sandra, you're absolutely right that wiping out Hamas, what are you going to do? Create a Hamas detector where you can like scan people's foreheads and then say, oh, boop, that's a Hamas. We're going to get them. How are you going to know? There's no way to wipe out the idea unless you make the idea less attractive than other options. If you had said, here's the replacement government we're going to bring in, or here's the strategy for reconstruction afterwards. It was the whole idea behind the Marshall Plan after World War II. The US and Britain bombed the hell out of Germany. And then they rebuilt it after the war because they said, we need you to be on our side. Mm-hmm. And the Soviet Union put in a ton of resources to rebuild the Soviet bloc countries too that had also been massively destroyed. I mean, Warsaw was totally gone. And it was rebuilt under the Soviets because it was on their side. So if Israel wants to, really wean the Palestinians off of Hamas, it has to provide incentive, something positive, and not, there has to be some carrot. It can't only be stick, stick, stick. Mm-hmm. I see a question in the chat. How does Israel confine captured Hamas gunmen? It is not in the civil prison system. They've set up some military camps, think Guantanamo and that kind of thing. And there have been absolutely questions about how humane the treatment is there and so on. I mean, they're prisoners of war from a non-state actor. They don't wear uniforms. They don't. They hide behind civilians. And so, what are the rules of war when it comes to imprisoning non-state actors? There are rules of war. We talked about that in a previous adult ed program last month. So Israel does have obligations as a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, even to non-state actors, even without uniforms, and so on. But the Palestinians not being a recognized nation and not wearing uniforms, not having an army, and not separating from the civilians creates problems for the treatment of their captives. And Israel should treat them humanely as a matter of ethics and values. This is where just because the other side is terrible doesn't mean you have to be as terrible. You can limit yourself in ways that are prudent while maintaining your sense of character and the sense that you are the righteous cause. And the more you undermine that, think about all the stories we got out of the American presence in Iraq with the Abu Ghraib prison and with the Blackwater contractors shooting up civilians. And, ultimately it undermined the value of the U.S. presence there and made it more dangerous for U.S. soldiers there because they lost the trust of the people. Hearts and minds, remember? Hearts and minds. So another question in the chat was, what are the positions of both presidential candidates on the war in Gaza? Biden has been relatively consistent in wanting to defeat Hamas and supporting Israel's mission in doing that, and in wanting to limit the civilian casualties. Now, again, that's sort of a which do you want, right? Just like the hostages versus Hamas. Well, you want to destroy Hamas, but you want to limit civilian casualties. There's going to be civilian casualties, and that's why there's all these protests happening all over the place, because there have been so many civilian casualties, no matter how you parse the numbers and count it. But he's provided billions of dollars of aid to Israel to replenish its armaments, to replenish its rocket defense systems. And he wants it over. I mean, you can tell by the amount of resources. Blinken has been to the Middle East like 8 times. He's there every month. They just sent the CIA chief to try to push the negotiated hostage settlement over the finish line. So they've put a lot of resources, and he's put a lot of political capital into trying to resolve it in a way that makes Israel feel safer, but that also preserves some Palestinian civilians. So that's where Biden has been. Trump has been a little bit more ambiguous. Surprise, surprise. He has said this is a really, really terrible PR issue. Israel shouldn't allow those pictures to be going around anywhere. And he feels like Israel should be, wrapping this up soon because he doesn't want to have to deal with it if he wins the presidency. He historically has been reflexively pro-Israel, and pro-settlement and pro-West Bank and so on. So I doubt that he would have any sympathies for he would have a lot of sympathies for the excesses that the right wing has done in the West Bank and wouldn't want to, crack the whip to get them to stop. I don't know that he would send a lot of money there, though. You remember, Make America Great Again includes an America First ideology that doesn't like foreign aid, doesn't want to send money to Ukraine, doesn't want to send money to Korea, doesn't want to send money to Israel. He might have to. But I think there's really a strong isolationist strain within the Republican Party. I mean, you saw people who historically have been reflexively pro-Israel vote against the last tranche of aid that was sent to Israel in the House of Representatives and even in the Senate. In fact, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which now has some PAC affiliates that are actually political action committees that can raise money for candidates and to support candidates, they actually discontinued fundraising for some of those people who were so pro-Israel that AIPAC would support them. But now people like Josh Hawley from Missouri and Ted Cruz from Texas, because they voted against funding Israel's needs in an isolationist direction, AIPAC says we're not going to fundraise for them anymore. That's unheard of, but that isolationism of America First is affecting Congress too. It's not just Trump. And so I don't know how long his commitment would be to supporting Israel. He certainly has no sympathy for the Palestinians. He wants an even harder line on Iran. He would have supported a much more robust response to the Iranian rocket and drone attack by Israel, and that might have led to a much larger conflagration. We just don't know what could have been, but I think if from the pro-Israel perspective, they might like Trump. If you're pro-Israel means let Israel do whatever the hell it wants to the Palestinians and be as militant as possible. But for people who are more inclined to peaceful negotiation and compromise, if you had to pick Biden or Trump for peaceful negotiation and compromise versus war, which would you pick? I don't think it's a rocket science decision.
I have one more.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to folks on the Jewish side of the spectrum who are making memes like some are right now, where it says, why do they hate us? And then it shows the far right Nazis on one side and the far left on the other side. And they're also denying the casualties. And some of those folks are in my own extended family. And I just basically said it's a little more nuanced than that. But there are people who are a little bit out there on each extreme of this situation, and there isn't very much middle ground, and there's a lot of hostility.
Yep. That's true. I mean, we haven't solved it with the American political situation, right? We haven't solved it on gun control. We haven't solved it on abortion. People tend to extremes, and we're in a moment in political history where the middle is losing ground to the extremes on many fronts. And the Israel-Palestine conflict is just another one of those that people are, when people are traumatized, they go into a bunker mentality. There's us and there's them, and we don't want to even see the humanity of the other side. And a lot of Jews have felt that way between, anti-Semitic incidents that have happened here and, of course, October 7th and this ongoing war conflict. There's a siege mentality that doesn't recognize the humanity of the other and doesn't want to admit it. It doesn't want to accept it. And it goes back to a cognitive function of our brains that's described by Jonathan Haidt in his The Righteous Mind, although he's drawing on other research, obviously. Well, we ask ourselves two questions, depending on whether we like the information or we don't like the information. If we like the information, we say, can I believe it? Like, is there any shred of possibility that what is being said is what I want to be true? So I want the Hamas numbers to be a total lie. I want Israel to have never intentionally killed a single civilian. I want all of the Palestinians to all love Hamas, so it's okay to kill any of them. So then you'd say, well, can I believe this? On the other hand, if the information that's provided undermines what you think, demonstrates that the Israeli army has been less than moral in certain circumstances, or members of the army have done terrible things, that maybe the Palestinian casualty numbers are legitimate or at least plausible given the circumstances and the number of population and so on. Well, then you ask yourself a different question. You say, must I believe it? Is there no way I can find to doubt it? Do I have to accept this? So the things we want to be true, can I believe it? I'll jump at anything. The things we don't want to be true, must I believe it? Can I find any way possible to reject it? So just as people on the left wing don't want to hear about rapes of women by Hamas, they don't want to hear about Hamas saying we need a dozen October 7th, which was said. They don't want to hear about Hamas treats the LGBTQ. That's I don't want to hear that. Must I believe that? No, I don't want to believe that. Because they're liberators. They're anti-colonial resistance fighters. So they must agree with me on gender identity. No. So this is the world we're in. It's the world of can I believe it for the things you want, and must I believe it for the things you don't? And most people don't want to face the hard reality of changing their mind or of living, as you said, with the nuance, with there may be truth on both sides. There was a wonderful collection of essays by the Israeli writer Aleph Bet Yehoshua, came out in the early 80s. It was called Between Right and Right. And so there's a reality that sometimes there's truth, there's justice, there's virtue on both sides, and there's evil and wickedness on both sides. One piece that's been making the rounds in the last couple of weeks on social media is a piece written by a Palestinian American, 50 things that are true about the conflict. You may have seen it shared on different people's Facebook feeds. I posted an article interviewing that guy, talking about how he wrote it and why and so on. And he says things like, Hamas has done terrible things. Israel has done terrible things. Some people in Israel are jerks. Some people in the Palestinians are jerks. Like these shouldn't be, earth-shattering revelations, the kind of things that he's saying. But people have been sharing it over and over again because it's a breath of fresh air that someone's actually saying, some reality, some nuance about the situation. So maybe people are starved for nuance, but the ones who are the most partisan are not going to be the ones that are going to be open to listening to it.